Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Ukraine Update from Compass Media. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by John Moran, former head of the foreign desk for the Irish Press, to have an overview of what's been happening in the Ukraine-Russia NATO war. John's going to give us an overview for a couple of minutes, and from that we're going to discuss those topics in more detail. John, what have you got for us this week?
Okay, while most commentators have been concentrated on the Ukrainian offensive in the Kherson, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia fronts, Russia appears to be mounting a minor offensive in the northeast, with small advances in the Lugansk and Kharkiv directions near the towns of Kupiansk, Svatove, and Kremenaya. On the Zaporizhia front in Orakovo, repeated Ukrainian attacks have been defeated with very heavy losses in men and material. Some 5 Leopard tanks and several Bradley fighting machines were also destroyed in these attacks. Similar attacks were also repulsed in nearby Piatikatki, north of Orakovo. In Donetsk, the Russian forces advanced along the flanks of Avdiivka, placing the only road into the town under operational fire control. Ukrainian defenders may not last much longer. The fall of Avdiivka will be a major loss for the Ukrainians, but would delight the citizens of Donetsk city and its environs who have suffered regular shelling from Avdiivka over the past 9 years. In the Bakhmut region, Ukrainian forces mount regular attacks to the south of the city towards Klishivka and also at the northern flanks near Soledar, in all cases without any major success. A Russian counterattack at Klishivka earlier today has pushed the Ukrainians back further from the besieged town. Along all the front from Kharkiv to Kherson, the big military problem facing Ukraine is that the wonder weapons they received recently from the Americans and the Germans, namely the Bradleys and the Leopards, have proved to be easy targets for Russian helicopters, gunners, drones, and mines. Interestingly, the Challenger tanks Britain handed over to Ukraine have yet to be produced in battle. The great vulnerability of these tanks, fighting machines, and troop carriers has made the Ukrainians change their attack mode from large-scale attacks using tanks and other fighting machines to attacking along tree lines with large groups of soldiers and little or no armor. However, these highly exposed companies of soldiers have proved very vulnerable to drones, mortars, and artillery. Consequently, losses in manpower are also huge using this approach. Both methods of attack have proved so costly and have revealed a huge shortcoming of the Ukrainians in terms of air support and longer-range artillery and rocket support. Russia is winning this war of attrition on the 1,000-meter kilometer meat grinder, which now extends from Bakhmut to all along the front lines. NATO summit. When the much-vaunted Ukrainian spring offensive failed to arrive on time, an idea was put forward that if a new offensive could at least show some territorial gains by the time the NATO summit took place in Vilnius, Lithuania, that such an offensive would be announced a success there. It is very likely that the large-scale attacks in Orakovo and Piatikatki in Zaporizhia yesterday were likely last-minute attacks intended to provide examples of such a success. Some optimistic NATO commentators on the Ukrainian offensive had been talking freely about splitting the Russian forces in half by sweeping down through Zaporizhia in a big arrow attack to the Azov Sea, thereby cutting Crimea off from the Russian mainland. But 6 weeks into the Ukrainian offensive in eastern and southern Ukraine, Kiev has little to show for all its effort along the front, except for a handful of tiny villages, a mass of its mangled fighting machines, and tens of thousands of dead soldiers. Ukraine is yet to reach the first line of the Russian defense. In the light of Ukrainian failures on the battlefield, the NATO meeting in Vilnius had to come up with some other successes. Some public relations position in a war that has gone horribly wrong for NATO and even worse for Ukraine. President Zelensky had hoped to regale his NATO sponsors with stories of the successes of his sparkling new wonder weapons donated by his sponsors in NATO, but it wasn't to be. All of these grievous issues seem a long time from just a few weeks ago when Prigozhin's Wagner group seemed to throw down a challenge to Moscow itself after a face-off in Rostov-on-Don. However, it has now emerged that President Putin has since invited Prigozhin and more than 30 of his senior commanders to Moscow, where the disputes were ironed out over a 3-hour meeting. Yesterday, the Wagner regiment's entire holding of weapons, from tanks to heavy artillery and machine guns, were all moved to an interior location to be checked and cleaned. As for the NATO meeting in Vilnius, the main point to emerge was that Ukraine could not become a member of NATO until after the war, and indeed only then if all NATO members agree. G7 countries have agreed to provide security for Ukraine in the period after the war, while they awaited entry into NATO. President Zelensky was very unhappy with this outcome, but the alternative was World War III. Had Ukraine been allowed to join NATO, Article 5 would have applied, which would have meant that all NATO countries would have been at war with Russia. The other point here is that many NATO countries believe NATO has a long way to go believe that Ukraine has a long way to go in terms of its democratic reforms before it is fit to join NATO. The only positive note in Vilnius was struck by Turkey lifting its objection to Sweden joining NATO. In doing so, President Erdogan hopes to ease his passage into the European Union. However, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor to the US President, poured cold water on this, saying, NATO is NATO, the EU is the EU, the US is not a member of the EU. The US has previously been in favor of Turkey's negotiations with Europe for the resumption of these negotiations. President Biden began to deal with this long before the question of Sweden's membership in NATO. So as far as we know, these topics are not connected. The as far as we know is an interesting qualifier in Mr. Sullivan's statement. In a sign of NATO's desperation in the war, the US has now agreed to release cluster bomb munitions to the Ukrainians. They did this in the teeth of opposition from other countries such as Germany, Italy, and Spain. Some 123 countries have a total ban on the use of cluster munitions. NATO's desperation is derived from the fact that Ukraine is running out of standard ammunition for its artillery, and so is NATO. The main concern over cluster bombs is that such munitions will not all detonate, and many will stay in the ground for decades, killing and injuring civilians long after the end of the conflict. People are still dying and being mutilated by unexploded mines, bombs, and cluster bombs in Laos and Cambodia today, some 50 years after the Vietnam conflict ended. Laos still has more than 75 million unexploded cluster bombs. The fact of the matter is that Ukraine has been using cluster bombs on the civilians of Donbass for the past 9 years. Tiny petal or butterfly bomblets have caused carnage on the streets of Donetsk and surrounding towns and villages. And yesterday, the Ukrainian army is reported to have fired off the first of its new batch of cluster bombs. What people in the West don't seem to know is that these cluster bombs will be used in those parts of Ukraine where the population actually prefers Russian rule. This population is seen by Ukraine as enemies within, as they have been seen since the start of hostilities in February 2014. These cluster bombs will now be used widely and indiscriminately by the Ukrainian military.
Thanks for that broad overview, John. Let's get stuck into looking at a couple of those subject matters in more detail. We will start off with your last story, the cluster bombs themselves. So Britain last month or the month before announced that it's going to send Ukrainian-tipped missiles to Ukraine. I believe that they have arrived. Now we have the Americans sending cluster bombs. Will any of this weaponry, first of all, what is the purpose in this? Is it a case that they don't have anything else? And the second question I put to you is, will there be any real military advantage to introducing cluster bombs and Uranian-tipped missiles in the overall scheme of things?
No, there is no military advantage in using these cluster munitions because there is a poor substitute for actual artillery. They can be used if you have vast numbers of soldiers in an open field and things like that. But they are no substitute for the artillery that they are fastly running out of. Indeed, some people believe that they will run out of ammunition by the middle to the end of August. So that will show you how desperate they are. Now, the fact of the matter is that they've been using cluster munitions in Donbass since 2014. The little bomblets that they use, the butterfly bombs, are notoriously hard to find. And worse than that, children pick them up because they look like little toys. So this has been going on for a long time. They confer no advantage, but they are horrendous for the civilians. And that's who I would be concerned about now.
And as well as that, even for their own troops, we just getting, and this links into the way the battle has, or the war zone has been happening for the last month and a half since the start of this so-called counteroffensive by Ukraine. There's been this toing and froing where Ukraine throws a lot of men, a lot of equipment into advancing. They advance a half a field, maybe if they're lucky, the whole length of a field. To achieve that, they lose so many men, so much material. And then you can guarantee within 24 hours, the Russians push them back using artillery assaults. The Russians are not engaging in this face-to-face battle. But if the Ukrainians introduce and use cluster mines, there's a hell of a high likelihood that their own troops will be injured by them because of this over and back kind of a thing that's happening. And the Russians have a lot more mine clearing equipment that they can put in front of their men as their men and material advances that the Ukrainians don't have. So again, is this just another own goal on the Ukrainian side in terms of, this is going to cause damage to their own side as much as anything else?
Well, the fact that they knew they were going to ship a lot of criticism for handing over these type of weapons, but the fact that they factor that in shows how desperate the Ukrainians are for artillery at this stage. The Russians have any amount of these kind of cluster bombs, variations on them. They haven't used, they've used them very small scale in the beginning, but they don't use them on a regular basis at all. They will be given an excuse now to use them if they want to. I just hope that they don't.
The disadvantage in terms of the ability to produce weaponry such as missiles and things like that. I just saw some stats that the Ministry of Defense from Russia released over the last 48 hours about increases in production over the last 12 months. And they are phenomenal. They're staggering. Some products have multiplied by 5,000% and more in terms of production. In terms of bullets, missiles, all those kind of things, the multiples are in the 10s, 20s, 30s, multiples of production of tanks, all that. And at that 12 months ago, they were at a high rate of production anyway. the inability of the West, collective West, to produce in anything like those terms just means that this war is lost for Ukraine. We'll talk about Vilnius in a little bit more detail in a second. Do you get a sense that the penny is dropping, even amongst the Ukrainian diehards, that something's got to give, that they're not winning this war? The counteroffensive is an obvious failure. It's an obvious flop. They're not winning. Do you get the sense that peace is near, or what sense are you getting at this stage?
Well, yeah, you can pick up that from the ordinary Ukrainian response. You can read what they say, and what they're saying is that they now realize how bad it is on the front, and how soon you could lose your life as soon as you arrive there. And Bakhmut, it was estimated that you would last 4 hours on the front line, which is incredible. It's an incredible thing to know before you go there. And the great population in Ukraine are now becoming more and more aware of the reality of what's happening, as opposed to the stories that were being handed out by the PR machine in Kiev.
And there's more and more reports coming out. Can't really be verified, but reports coming out that there were some videos that it would be indicated in it that tank drivers on the Ukrainian side, personnel carrier drivers, there before they go towards the minefields that they've been told to drive through, they actually stop when they turn back, or some of them pretend that their vehicles have broken down. It's for self-protection, because you're guaranteed you're going to be blown to bits if you go into that minefield that their commanders are sending them into. So we have that happening as well. But there was a distinct change in tactics on the Ukrainian side over the last week and a half, where before they were sending in columns of tanks and personnel carriers that were getting blown to bits by mines and artillery fire. They've changed tactic in the last week and a half, and they seem to be sending small units and platoons in through wooded areas, as you were saying, and wee strips of woodland to try to make advances. But the Russians have changed their tactics in response to that as well. Have you any more information about these tactical changes? Have there been of any benefit to the Ukrainian side, or is it just carnage with a different hat on?
It is. It was born out of desperation. When they saw that, as they tried to move tanks and fighting machines and troop carriers across open areas, they were being devastated, not just by artillery, but by mines and by drones, which were particularly effective. The new drone was very effective against tanks. So they don't have a long shelf life once they appear. I don't think they thought it was going to be this bad, the Ukrainians. But anyone who, can imagine two armies fighting, and one of them has an air force and the other doesn't, in a modern day and age, that's what we're talking about at the moment.
I've noticed a change in the type of footage that's coming out of the battlefront, where up until about a week and a half ago, it was all aerial assaults on armored vehicles. But there's a lot more footage coming out now from the videos on the helmets of Ukrainian soldiers in particular, where they are in firefights in terms of using weapons like guns, automatic weapons, things like that, that they're involved in firefights, that they're getting taken out, that they are advancing through these forest areas with small weaponry, and they have to deal with, on the one hand, being bombarded by artillery, and then if they get in anywhere near any Russian positions, they're taken out with gunfire. And it's just, although it's a change of means of wiping out the Ukrainian forces, it's just horrific to see. And the sooner that this comes to a stop, the better, because these days, quite often when I listen to commentators, their focus seems to be on the amount of tanks taken out, the amount of armored personnel carriers. And the figures that they give last are personnel, soldiers, human beings. And pulling that humanity in and seeing these stories, real stories, is very important. And so I would encourage people to go on to the Telegram channels and watch how people are dying. and come to the conclusion that this has to stop through a negotiated peace, that there's no other way. Just going back to the NATO Vilnius summit, John, there seems to be a lot of fractures being publicly aired and shown at this summit. Zelensky was very nasty in terms of his statements about Ukraine not being allowed to join NATO straight away. The British Secretary for Defense, Ben Wallace, said that Ukraine and Zelensky wasn't grateful enough, and they seemed to be showing ingratitude. Some American commentators said the same thing. Zelensky's sarcastic remark back to that was, well, if Ben Wallace wants to write down how he would like to be thanked, that we'll thank him as many times as he wants every morning. So all these cracks seem to be showing. Is this the beginning of the end of NATO and Ukraine in terms of the support they've been given? And a bigger question, is it the beginning of the end of NATO?
Well, I think the summit in Vilnius itself was a disaster. It was barely papered over the cracks of what was going on there. You could see there are photographs of Zelensky standing on his own and looking lost. And he is lost, and Ukraine is lost, because what has happened is they won't support him when he's looking for a war that involves everybody, which is what he's looking for by joining NATO, knowing that it will have to involve the other members. So he's not going to get that. So he was stamping his feet a little, and he knows he can insult everybody except the Americans. So, but he was foolish, I think, to be as ungrateful as he appeared, biting the hand that feeds him.
And his sarcasm back as well. Like, apparently he has put out a statement today talking about weapons, and he said thank you over 40 times in that statement. And that again seems like sarcasm. It seems like this kind of there's an unpleasant side to this man that I think we'll see more and more over the next few months in particular. Two topics to cover, John. We're running short on time. Turkey, Erdogan, and what appears to be double treachery against Russia. On the one hand, Erdogan has released 3 Azov officers, so Azov, and original Azov officers, which is a neo-Nazi originated military unit within Ukraine. When Mariupol fell, there was an agreement between Turkey, Russia and Ukraine that these 3 Azov officers would be moved to Turkey until such time as the war was over. Erdogan seems to have broken that agreement on Sunday, and these 3 officers flew with Zelensky and Zelensky's private plane from Turkey back to Ukraine on Saturday. The second apparent act of treachery is allowing Sweden to join NATO. I'm not sure the significance of this in the bigger scheme of things, John. How significant is this? Is this real acts of treachery, or what's happening here?
Well, there was a tweet, I think, Erdogan put out before the meeting where he sort of suggested that the price of his agreement was that he would get into the EU if he lifted his ban on Sweden. There would be a quid pro quo. But that sort of idea plays fast and loose with the idea of sovereign states in the European Union, who are only pawns in the game involving NATO and the US. So that's problematic. But the whole Erdogan episode struck me as he was looking for something. He put his NATO hat on, and he wants to get into the EU. And if he can't get in, what he would like would be for free travel for Turks within the EU. So it'll be interesting to see if anything happens along those lines in the foreseeable future, because he is a grumpy guy and he's not prone to giving something until he gets something.
Erdogan, the tricky Turk, I think I heard you say one time
Indeed.
before. Yeah. Is this linked in any way to the grain deal? So this grain deal, Russia has said that it will no longer. So this grain deal had to be renewed every so often. This is a deal that allowed the free flow of grain via the Black Sea into around the world, essentially. It was supposed to be around the world. It didn't transpire that way. And so that there would be no hostilities in the Black Sea area. An agreement between Ukraine and Russia that was allegedly, on the face of it, negotiated by Erdogan. And it's something that Erdogan got a lot of kudos for globally. Russia has stated that Ukraine has breached the deal on numerous occasions, using that Black Sea area for military operations. And as such, it's not going to continue with a renewal of the grain deal. It actually did launch an assault on military targets in Odessa over the last 48 hours, showing that it's seriously not renewing the deal. The deal's gone. Some commentators have suggested this is Erdogan getting back at Putin for dumping the grain deal. But when you actually look at it in reality, three Azov commanders and Sweden, which was essentially a member of NATO anyway, in terms of the work that it does with NATO, Sweden's accession to NATO, it's not really that big a deal for Russia at all, is it?
No, well, the only person that is a really big deal to is Zelensky. And as I say, I suspect it could be linked to the whole NATO summit thing, that Zelensky had to have something at home that satisfied the far right. And that would be something that would maybe keep them a little bit quiet, despite the fact that they got nothing in Vilnius.
Yeah, yeah. And it's sad that these games are being played while so many lives are being lost and destroyed. Not just on the battlefield, but throughout Ukraine. People who've had the 7 million people who've fled Ukraine in the last 18 or 19 months. And that these kind of petty political games are being played, the likes of Erdogan and Zelensky and others, and some Russians as well, I'm sure, just trying to propagandize all of this and see it almost like a sport, as opposed to seeing the human lives that have been lost on a daily basis. There is a sense that there are peace negotiations coming. We know that the Americans sent over a group of retired Pentagon and White House staff to speak with the Russians about the possibility of negotiations into the future. Biden's office has come out and said he wasn't aware of that. That's clearly just a facade. And it does seem like the Americans want to do business now.
Yeah, well, you see, we're coming towards the end of the summer. And one of the biggest blows to Europe, to the European Union, will be next year, next winter. The next winter will be pretty difficult here, because they had some reserves in oil and gas for last year, which took us through, and we didn't have a very grievous winter either. So people have been saying for quite a while that the second year will be much worse than the first. So that's one thing that's already there. And there are talks that I hear where people are thinking in terms of December. If we're still where we are from December, something will happen. That people will get together and try and get another way out of this mess that we're in.
Not how many people have to die between now and December, and if they just start talking in
Tens of
December,
thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. That's a tragedy.
it's just outrageous. We're going to finish up in a final story, John. It's a graph, and it's a graph of the amount of crude oil reserves that the United States has, its capacity, what it has at the moment. It's as low as it was in August 1983, which is the last time US crude oil reserves were so low. We have a situation where the United States appears to be running out of arms, missiles, and weaponry, and it can't send any more over to Ukraine, and so it's sending cluster missiles. The German and overall European ability to provide weaponry seems to have collapsed. The economies, particularly the German economy, is collapsing at the moment. It looks like a lot of the US figures are being buoyed in terms of economic figures, are being buoyed to a degree by this weaponry that it's producing for this war and other wars around the world as well. There seems to be a general rusting and degeneration of the West in terms of its capacity to, on the one hand, provide the basics of energy, and with this grain deal collapsing, food and stuff like that into the near future, but also the ability to defend itself in any military conflict into the future. And yet, when you listen to the politicians, when you listen to the media, everything's rosy and we haven't ever done so well. What is happening here?
Yeah, well, the what we get from the mainstream media has changed so much in the past 3 or 4 years, ever since the virus came along, COVID came along and changed our ways, and there has been a state of flux and insecurity around the world, with various things happening one after the other, from Brexit to COVID now to this, and we're in a mess. In my own view, I think we're at the end of empire time for the United States and its acolytes, the white Europeans. And I think the new world order is about to present itself, which will be completely different than the one that we currently live in. And it'll be a much more democratic, multipolar view of how to get along with each other in the world.
The theory of the collapse of empire suggests that there is a period of stagnation, and then there's a sudden collapse, and that sudden collapse can be reflected in military failures globally. So I noted that there has been increased activity against US presence in Syria and in Iraq and other places. And I've got a feeling that the enemy of the US empire around the world are seeing this as to their advantage, this war in Ukraine, in terms of the stretch that the United States has. And overstretch has always been the reason why empires collapse. It would appear that Ukraine may be that catalyst for the increase in pace of collapse. We've seen this stagnation. We've seen the de-dollarization process, which is just growing more and more. But usually, in terms of the theory of empire collapse, few sudden shocks occur and then it goes pop. Do you think we're nearly there yet, or do you think we're 100 years away from that?
Oh no, we're not 100 years away. I mean, I think that by all accounts, there are tremendous problems ahead within the next 6 months for the American economy and debt repayments. And everywhere you look for the Americans, things are looking bad. They've lost. They are currently in the process of losing their number one position in the world, and that the vast majority of people in the world now don't want to be part of their order. So things will have to change there. I would love to see the American political system reflecting what the ordinary people of America want, rather than all the bribed politicians who are bribed by the big weapons manufacturers and by big pharma and Wall Street, who really run the show over there. That has to stop.
No, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, but who knows? There could be a sudden
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. I don't want to see harm come to the American people.
Oh, certainly not. No, as I've always said, it's the State Department where the problem lies, dealing with the small group of individuals from Blinken and Newland and a few others,
and their connections with that military industrial.
Yeah, they're just too close.
Yeah. John, that's all we have time for this week. Thanks for joining us again. We'll be back next week. Keep an eye out, folks. Like, share, subscribe where you can. We're battling the algorithms as usual. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.